Presenting is entitled Cripping Sexuality Education in a Canadian Context, the Invisibilization of Disabled Students and Children in Comprehensive Sexuality Education in Canada, and they hail from the University of Guelph. So Adam Davies is an assistant professor in family relations and human development at the University of Guelph. Adam's research involves K-12 schooling, early childhood education and care, queer theory, MAD studies, and sexuality education. Adam's research has investigated the recent Ontario updates to sexuality education, the experiences of gender and sexual minority students and children, as well as issues pertaining to queer masculinities. Adam is an Ontario certified teacher and registered early childhood educator. Rsha is a master's student in family relations and human development at the University of Guelph, whose work focuses on sexuality education for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Rsha completed her undergraduate studies in psychology at Western University, where she first began her research involving individuals with developmental disabilities. The main objective of her research is to aid in the development of comprehensive sexuality education programs that specifically target individuals with intellectual disabilities in hopes of increasing safety, preventing sexual abuse and exploitation, and encouraging informed choices regarding sexual health and well-being. Take it away, Adam.
Great, thank you. And just as a note, how much time do I have again?
Unmute myself. You have about 20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we have plenty of time here.
Great. Just to give me an idea. So thank you so much for the introduction. So as was articulated, my name is Adam Davies. I am from the University of Guelph, and I'm an assistant professor in family relations and human development. So a big portion of my research program involves both disability studies and sexuality education. So today I will be presenting some background context on both the recent updates and controversies around sexuality education in Canada, but also because my work focuses specifically in Ontario, the Ontario situation will be discussed. And then also the invisibilization and erasure of disabled students within these discussions as well. I do want to note that I will be using both identity first language and person first language throughout the presentation to respect the various ways in which people in the disability community identify. So I also want to give a land acknowledgement today because I am coming from Guelph. Guelph is where I live and where I'm situated, and it's also where the University of Guelph is located. So the University of Guelph resides on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize this gathering place where we work and learn is home to many past, present, and future First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Our acknowledgement of the land is our declaration of our collective responsibility to this place and its people's histories, rights, and presence. Our school supports and adds our collective voice to the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee on Residential Schools to never forget, to hold governments and colonial forces to account, to seek redress and healing for injustice. And that's from the School of English and Theatre Studies. One thing I want to do when I begin this talk is also situate and locate myself as a researcher and an individual. So I am able-bodied. I do not identify as having a physical impairment, but I do identify as someone with chronic mental illness, and I also identify as someone with ADHD, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder. I want to also situate myself as someone who predominantly uses cultural studies frameworks and sociological frameworks, but will also be referencing the DSM within this presentation as well too. So my outline for the talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about cripping and what cripping means for me, especially in relationship with sexuality education. The current neoliberal context of austerity and how that erases disabled people, a little bit about disabled sexualities and intimacies, and then I'm going to lead into an overarching conversation of what comprehensive sexuality education is and the exclusion of disabled students from comprehensive sexuality education. I'm going to then lead into student Rsha's research project and I'm going to outline where she's at in her current research and some of her questions as she begins her research on sexuality education for those with intellectual disabilities. So cripping. I'm going to define cripping, and I predominantly draw from Robert McCruer's work on cripping and crip theory. So crip theory resists delimiting the kinds of bodies and abilities that are acceptable, quote, unquote. And also crip theory, quote, requires comprehending the able-bodied disabled binary as non-normal and hierarchical or cultural and political rather than self-evident and universal, end quote. And then from my own work with Noah Keneally, we define cripping drawing from McCreer as reclaiming the term crip as part of a disabled identity and finding value in that which is devalued while problematizing taken for granted norms and ideologies that reproduce ableism. So a big part of what we want to do in cripping comprehensive sexuality is disrupt the normative student or child who is imagined within comprehensive sexuality education, who is predominantly neurotypical and able-bodied, and carve out space specifically for the needs of disabled students and how the current situation of comprehensive sexuality education in an international context, but also here within Canada and Ontario, ignores the needs of disabled students. I want to briefly touch on this idea of austerity politics, with austerity meaning the neoliberal context that promotes ableism and survival of the fittest mentality. So Dan Goodley, who is a disability studies scholar, writes predominantly on austerity politics within Britain, while several scholars have also started to take this up within a North American context. And Dan Goodley and others define austerity politics as the expectation for individuals to, quote, overcome economic downturn and respond to austerity through adhering to ableism's ideals, its narrow conceptions of personhood, its arrogance, and its propensity to buddy up with other fascist ideologies that celebrate the minority over the majority, end quote. What I'd really like to emphasize within this quote is the idea of these narrow conceptions of personhood, in particular, the ideas of autonomy and individuality that often percolate within liberal ideas of sexuality and sexuality education, and how that often, in particular, others, disabled and neuroatypical students and learners. So a quick note on disabled sexualities and intimacies. We know that LGBTQ disabled individuals are often invisibilized, in particular the intersections of LGBTQ identity and disability. LGBTQ disabled students often do not receive appropriate sex education, and nor do they experience open conversations about LGBTQ plus identities from educators. And in particular, the sexual behaviors and desires of disabled youth are commonly constructed through notions of risk and how these ideas of risk can pathologize disabled sexualities. So to begin, what I'd like to do is just quickly show a video. And this video is about intimacy for disabled people and constructions of, or pardon me, I should say stigma around both disability and sexuality. Let me just find my share thing here.
A magazine cover, and they asked me how I wanted to be described. And I said, oh, call me deliciously disabled. And then that kind of went viral as a little hashtag, and I played with that for a little bit. And then a few months later, Stella approached me and said, you know, we want to put together a sex party for people with disabilities. Would you want to join? And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing, yes.
I kept seeing his stuff pop up online, and I thought that what he was doing was really interesting and that we could partner together for this particular event. And when we started working on it, we realized how complementary our work was and how we could sort of join forces.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much stigma around sex and disability. There's just a lot of fear around it, and I think it's based around a lack of exposure and a lack of positive role models to see people with disabilities owning their sexuality and owning their bodies and their selves and all that stuff. And I think it just comes from, we don't see it in popular media. We don't see sexualized disabled bodies positively represented or even negatively represented. We just don't see it, period.
There's this stereotype that people with disabilities are asexual, or that they can't enjoy sex, or that they're not interested in love and intimacy. And there's also the polar opposite stereotype that people with disabilities might be hypersexual, and that's all that they're interested in. And sometimes there's the idea that people with disabilities are unable to give consent. So there's also this infantilization that happens, and people are just not sure how to approach the issue at all.
People assume that you can't perform sexually, especially for me as a man. People assume that I can't perform, so that I'm not sexually viable. In terms of romance would be something that I would like to have happen to me organically. People either don't want to engage in that because they're afraid they're going to have to take care of me, or they want to be my boyfriend right away because they somehow want to, again, take care of me, and that's really not something that I want.
There's a lot of courtesy stigma that is attached to men that date less than able-bodied women, and it's because it's still sort of attached to their status in society, and what is wrong with you if you're dating somebody who's disabled. And peers and parents can have a big influence on that as well, sort of not wanting to see you with anyone who's less than perfect or ideal.
I'm afraid of rejection all the time, so sometimes I don't go out and I don't put myself out there as much as I'd like to, because well, what's the point? I'm going to get rejected. People are afraid that I'm going to be too clingy if they engage with me, which is sometimes true, because I want that connection so much. And social barriers is again, just lack of exposure. People don't see people with disabilities being sexualized in any sort of way. So when somebody sees somebody like me and is attracted and wants to explore, they have no framework in which to do that safely, or they have no role model to draw from to say, oh, I've seen this happen, so I kind of understand how to do this. So there's a lot of barriers, and I think the biggest barrier is fear. People are just afraid. I'm afraid of rejection, and they're afraid of engaging because they haven't seen it before.
So I wanted to start with that video to talk about some of the barriers that exist in terms of intimacy, romance, and sexuality for learners and students and adults with disabilities. And I'll get into those barriers as well in the presentation. So, of course, there's connections that I want to draw in terms of, the interconnections between disability, gender, and sexuality as well. Historically speaking, the connections, or there have been connections between the regulation of disability, in particular autism, and the regulation of gender and sexuality, and how this has happened through behavioral analysis. And then in particular for young feminine boys, they were often targeted through the DSM. So comprehensive sexuality education here in Ontario includes a liberal approach to sexuality education that provides information beyond an abstinence approach. It includes holistic development in cognitive, social, emotional, and physical realms, and it focuses on bodily autonomy, consent, sexual identity, gender expression and identity, and includes conversations of mental health and wellness as well. Here in an Ontario context, as well as within the rest of Canada, CSC has become the grounds of ideological battles and debates, in particular because of its inclusion of conversations around gender identity and sexual orientation. And then in particular, this has become prominent around debates between what have been termed parents' rights. So parents' rights to control the content of what their children learn at school, and to also withdraw their children from classes that they deem inappropriate for their children. And then also students' human rights to learning content around gender and sexuality. So there are many barriers to sexuality education for students with disabilities, and the Public Health Agency of Canada has noted 3 barriers in particular, including physical barriers. So for students who might be in special education settings, they might be excluded from sexuality education that could take place in gym classes in physical education. attitudinal barriers, which were discussed in the video in terms of stigmatization of individuals with disabilities, and also the idea that they might not have a sexuality. And then also economic barriers, which could include also the ability to purchase items such as sex toys, the ability to purchase clothing as well, the ability to pay entrance fees to enter different clubs and institutions. There's also barriers with places like bathhouses and sex clubs because of perhaps a lack of physical accessibility as well too. So sexuality education is a human right, and it has been declared a human right as per the United Nations. The United Nations supports a comprehensive sexuality education approach. And in particular, it's also enshrined in children through the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was created through the United Nations in 1989. In particular, Article 13, the freedom of expression, Article 17, which is all children's right to access information about mental and physical health, and Article 24, which is the state's duty to provide preventative health care, protect the child's right to accessing sexuality education. As well, individual with disabilities' rights to accessing sexuality education is enshrined through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So here in Ontario, as I mentioned, there was large ideological debates about parents' rights to withdraw their child from content that they deem inappropriate, such as perhaps sexuality education, and children's rights to accessing sexual health information. Of course, as has been written about by scholars, in particular, the work of Lauren Bialystok, this binary is a false binary and is often just ideologically drawn. But what happens is two parties seem oppositional to each other. So you have the parents and then you have the child. So what this does in particular for children and youth with disabilities is it often puts them in a precarious position, in particular if they are LGBTQ and also disabled, and they might have certain dependencies or reliances on their parents, or they might not be out to their parent about their sexual and gender identity. So I wrote an article about this. And so without wanting to seem too vain, I'm going to quote myself. And I'm going to say, for children with disabilities who are often reliant on parents and family members for care, whether through physical, emotional, or financial assistance, pitting their rights against their parents creates a dangerous dichotomy. Moreover, this dichotomy can position LGBTQ children and youth with disabilities who might not be out to families in a liminal position where they could risk losing parental support by being open about their wish to be authenticated and validated in their gender and sexual identity at school. So, of course, in particular for children and youth with disabilities who might be LGBTQ, that puts them at a precarious position. Now, I've written about, in particular, some recommendations for updating our sexual health education in Canada for students with autism. And I think some of these recommendations also carry forward into disability, largely speaking. So a team and I wrote an article that I put the citation there if you're interested, that I will very briefly go over, saying some areas of need in terms of information for sexual health information for students and learners with disabilities is area around puberty and bodily development, relationships in particular, because often children with disabilities are excluded in school settings from their able-bodied and neurotypical peers. And then also information around gender and sexual diversity and the intersections of LGBTQ identity and disability identity. So some specific recommendations that we made are to include skill building within sexuality education and specific scenarios that children and youth with disabilities can work through and problem solve together. To incorporate autistic advocates' voices in curricula development, and I would widen that to say include disabled activists widely speaking in curricula development, and then also to provide educators with professional development opportunities. I'm going to really briefly go over my student Rsha's research study. I know I'm short for time. Am I short for time now?
You have about 3 minutes.
Okay, I will very, very quickly go through it. So Rsha, my graduate student, is interested in particular of researching the kind of sexuality education that individuals with intellectual disability received when they were in the formal school system. And so I will just keep kind of going through some of her slides because of time. Again, I want to hit on the fact that comprehensive sex education is still being implemented in an Ontario context, widely speaking. So in particular for learners and students who have intellectual disabilities who might be excluded from their mainstream school setting, this often means a complete lack of sexuality education within schools. In particular, as I mentioned earlier, this is often the case because of the fact that these learners do not maybe participate in gym class or health and physical education. And so because sexuality education is often tied to gym class, this means that they are excluded from those conversations. As well, special education educators are often not trained to address sexuality education within their classroom settings. It's been written about through the literature that well-designed sexual health education programs have a major positive impact on sexual health among youth, widely speaking, and this includes those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and it also can empower them to express and advocate for their own rights to sexual expression. So the aims of her study are to identify the feelings and needs that young people with intellectual disability have upon reflecting on their experiences in the formal sex education or experiencing formal sex education, to examine the sexual knowledge and awareness that levels of young people with intellectual disability have, and then to determine whether individuals with intellectual disabilities perceive that they are experiencing barriers to sexuality education as a result of their disability. Her methods are mixed methods. I won't go into all the fancy scales she's using because she's a lot more quantitative oriented than I am, but she's also going to have some open-ended qualitative measures, and she's using a survey approach. So I'm going to leave it there because I know that we were rushed for time at the end, but thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate you letting me share some of my work and my students' work. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, and especially for keeping it on time. I know
You're welcome.
That's always hard.
No worries. Thank you.
So going to our next speaker, Dev Ramaswamy, introducing the CRIP Collective's work towards disability justice. Dev Ramaswamy, I'm really sorry about that, is a disabled, non-binary, Indo-Canadian, Caribbean, multidisciplinary producer whose work focuses on their intersecting identities. They write creative nonfiction, fiction, and journalism. They are a podcaster, filmmaker, model, and horror aficionado. I love horror, that's just me. They've been published in CBC, Rsha, HuffPost Canada, and other publications. They also facilitate workshops independently and with a collective called CRIP, that's C-R-I-P, about topics such as ableism, disability justice, media, storytelling, content creation, and more. You can find them on Twitter and TikTok at Murky Waters, that's MERKYYWATERS, and on Instagram at Murky Waters, that's MERKYY_WATERS. And I'm going to copy the TikTok and Twitter accounts into the chat so folks could just copy them there.
Thank you. So I'm going to do a quick visual description of myself before I hop into my presentation on CRIP. So I am a light to medium brown skin non-binary person in their late 20s. I've got very short, kind of fluffy bleached hair with dark roots, and I'm wearing over-the-ear headphones. I've got 2 nose rings, a septum, and a nostril, and I'm wearing a tie-dye hoodie, and my background is blurred, but it's got kind of a purpley hue, and it's my bedroom here in Toronto. So I'll quickly share my screen. So I'm here to talk about a collective that I am a part of called CRIP. We are so who are we? We are a collective based out of Toronto for the most part, using arts and education to facilitate connections within the disabled community and beyond. So we do things like workshops, community spaces, and things like that, which I'll get into a little bit more. But first, I'll introduce you to myself and members of the rest of the collective. So first, there's me, and on this slide, I've got a collage of images related to my work. There are some podcast cover arts, including Possibilities Podcast, Leaders of Color, Six Ed World, and Representation. I've got some video screens like from TikTok and a short film I did called Fluid, as well as the logo for Radio Lumi and some screenshots of some writing work, like a story called Surgical Mask, an article I wrote called Incontinence is a Public Health Issue and We Need to Talk About It, as well as a poetry zine that is called This Is What Happens When Monsters Write Poetry. And I've got some of my those contact handles and stuff in there as well. So I come from a media background. I call myself a multidisciplinary producer because I just kind of go with whatever medium sort of presents itself to me, or whatever story it is I'm trying to share. I have also produced work under the name Mari. I am gender fluid, and Mari is sort of an old placeholder name that I was using for a while, but have been going by Dev recently and use they, them pronouns. So the disability, CRIP was a collective that was founded by myself and Kate Welsh. Kate is a queer disabled artist, community activist, and educator. Their work focuses on the impacts of ableism and oppression. Oppression on mental health. Kate is currently a disability affirming mental health counselor and facilitates workshops on a variety of topics as well. We co-founded and developed our first workshop, Unpacking Ableism, back in 2018. And Kate has a website, katewelsh.ca, or you can find them on Instagram at Crip Counseling as well. And so I'll get into a little bit about how we started and all of that a little bit later. But we've recently added several members to our collective, including Janelle Anderson. Janelle Anderson is a Black disabled social worker and researcher focusing on community engaged research with and for marginalized populations, particularly those with intersecting identities of Blackness, disability, and immigration. Her latest work examines gaps in research in culturally responsive service delivery for Black Canadians with disabilities. And Janelle's, if you needed a description of the earlier slide, sorry about that. There's some images of some CRIP-focused wellness cards, which are like, instead of those like get well cards that you would find at like hospital gift shops and things like that, these are cards that you can give your chronically ill friends to acknowledge that they may not get better soon and that this is an ongoing thing, but that doesn't mean you aren't still sending them care and affection. Kate also started an initiative here in Toronto that's based off of some work, I think that was from the Bay Area, called Equity Buttons. And they are these buttons that down here that say, please offer me a seat, or my disability isn't visible, and things like that. And they also are part of their counseling practice is called Disability Affirming Counseling, and they have a logo of with some plant leaves and a cane with rainbow colors on it. And for Janelle, she has a Jamaican flag, a black hat, some plants. I'm not sure if I should know this person, but a Black woman with afro and is sitting in a chair. The logo for the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, BLM, and the logo for Stella's Place. We also have Kitty. Kitty is a queer South Asian and agender artist who is passionate about community building and all things design, an avid collector of information. They are driven to connect people with affordable resources and caring support. They are a lifelong student of anti-oppression work. And my notes just disappeared on me, so give me a quick second to pull them out again. I always have tech issues in the middle of a presentation. It's, you know, how things go. They are a lifelong student of anti-oppression work, creating safer spaces and design for social change. And Kitty has the laurels for the Toronto Queer Film Festival for 2021 for their short film, which they have a still of. They have an image of their cat, Ether, an image of themselves in a LARP, which is live action role play. Costume, I'm not sure if that's the right word for it, a D20 or a 20-sided die and a feather and a sticky note that says, "I can go slowly and still help my communities and loved ones." We also have Salima. Salima Punjani is a registered social worker and multisensory artist grounded in relational aesthetics. A common thread through all of her work is the creation of environments that allow for receptivity of connection. She is particularly interested in how multiple senses can be used to expand the possibilities for disabled people to feel welcome in art spaces, as well as to create artful experiences of empathy, intimacy, and connection. And there are some images of some of Salima's work on there as well, including some images from Moms of Montreal, some headphones on display with, it looks like either CT or MRI scan of some brains, and an image of a still from what looks like a video on meditation or yoga, something like that. And finally, we have Kane Nathaniel. Kane Nathaniel is a queer trans shape-shifting experience who is of the Afro and Indo-Caribbean diaspora. When they're not running a personal blog on his Instagram about his ongoing transition, she is known to do commercials and media bookings, facilitation, and peer support for QT BIPOC as a freelancer. You can find them on Out TV as part of the Cast for Shine True, a new docuseries that highlights the stories of trans and gender diverse BIPOC as they navigate gender identity and self-expression. And there's an image of Kane with a ring light, a feelings wheel, a sort of like not clip art, but you know, those illustrations of individuals talking, as well as the book covers for Skip. Our work is everywhere, an illustrated oral history of queer and trans resistance, the stars and the blackness between them, care work, feelings, and beyond incarceration, sorry. Sorry, just trying to move things and they refuse to do that. All right, so how did we start? As I mentioned, Kate and I started CRIP back in, we first started talking at the end of 2017, and by early 2018, we had sort of decided that there was a gap in anti-oppression training around disability and ableism. And we decided that we wanted to fill that gap. So originally it was Kate Welsh, myself, and another facilitator named Jade Hines. And we developed the first Unpacking Ableism workshop in August of 2018, which we facilitated independently at the CSI Spadina building. And it was actually like super well attended, with folks from a bunch of organizations who just found us because they were searching for disability anti-oppression training, and we were the only things that popped up. So we decided to kind of work together as a collective at that point, and that's when we started CRIP, which stands for Community Resistance Intimacy Project. And that is because we are very rooted in ideas of community building, of intimacy, as well as, but still centering that idea of pushing back against oppressive systems, and not just being palatable for bigger groups. Jade didn't end up continuing on with the collective, and so it was myself and Kate for a few years until May of this year. We ended up, we had picked up so much steam and were receiving so many opportunities that we just did not have capacity for. And we really wanted to include more of our community in this work. So we reached out to our communities for BIPOC voices, trying to get specifically queer and trans, disabled, BIPOC, and we ended up with Salima, Kane, Janelle, and Kitty. How much time do I have?
You have exactly 7 minutes, sorry.
So, perfect. So, as I mentioned before, our focus is centering the wisdom and knowledge of queer and racialized disability community. This is because of the ways that race and like queerness intersect with disability to create these very unique and complex experiences that compound these systems of oppression. And so this can include things like experiencing medical racism and transphobia. There's a phenomenon that's been termed trans broken arm syndrome, which is when once trans people start medically transitioning, many of their health issues often are dismissed as symptoms of or effects of their transition, and that the only way to address them is to stop transitioning or to detransition, putting disabled trans people in a very precarious situation. We also have heard many experiences of medical racism that has led to either exacerbated illness or deaths in Black and Indigenous communities, as well as knowing that for Black and Indigenous communities as well, for disabled people of those communities, they are more likely to be perceived as aggressive or non-compliant, regardless of whether or not they have the ability to communicate with law enforcement, and are more likely to be victims of police brutality. It's actually, I think, half of police brutality victims have a disability of some kind, whether it's physical, mental, intellectual, or otherwise. So that's sort of why we started doing the work that we have been doing, because it is very important for us to always be centering these experiences within our anti-oppression training instead of focusing on white or cis or middle-class bodies. We also talk about things like the disability poverty cycle and things like that. So we have run Unpacking Ableism, as well as community art spaces, as well as support groups for organizations like LGBT Youth Line, Youth Project out in Halifax, ex-university, the University of Guelph, U of T in multiple capacities, actually, Planned Parenthood, or PPT, Rainbow Health Ontario, Fresh Restaurants, a company called Architect, QP 3903, which is the Union for Public Service Workers, I believe it is, and Halton Region. And I'm sure there are others, but honestly, we've been doing so many that it's hard to keep track. And so we also have provided consulting services on production materials. We did one on Show Bible from BGM, which is a production company, as well as on some online courses for a project called Grit, which is, I believe, through the Revision Center at Guelph University, at the University of Guelph. Yeah, we're continuing to develop more workshops, as well as try to build more community spaces, as well as expanding upon our own individual work. So, for example, Kate is very focused on mental health as a counselor. I'm focused on media representation. I believe it's Janelle that is in social work. Salima is more experimental artist, that kind of thing. So we all have our own areas where we are expanding our work in different ways. That being said, we do still have room to grow. We are trying to expand our reach in terms of who we're reaching. We really want to start talking with mental health professionals about the impacts of ableism on mental health, the ways that mental health professionals can perpetuate ableism and stigma. We want to work with more medical professionals as well. We want to develop more community spaces, do more work to build connections within our communities so that disabled folks from all kinds of identities can find folks who have similar experiences to them so they don't feel so alone. And we also are hoping to eventually continue to grow the collective. We are very aware that we are missing trans feminine voices, so we are missing perspectives of trans misogyny affected individuals, as well as Indigenous voices of any kind. We know that there are ways that they are impacted that we may be missing. And so we are hoping to eventually develop our group into a collective that does more deeply represent the different communities that are within the disability community. And that's pretty much it for me. And Cripp, I hope I kept that under time.
That actually is perfectly timing. You're right at the very minute. I'm just going to turn on my video here. Thank you so much for that great presentation. I'll definitely be checking out your work and Cripp's work. So going into our final presentation. Oh, and I want to make a quick note. Please, if you have questions, please submit them to the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen, in the middle it'll say Q&A, and you can just follow through there to submit your questions. So going to our last presenter, Sid Ferranto, who's speaking about the pathologization of gender nonconformity. Sid is a neurodivergent trans person who recently graduated from UT in psychology and neuroscience. Although they enjoyed their academic experience, they also faced extensive discrimination and erasure throughout their time at university. The content of their psychology and neuroscience courses was often presented in ways that assumed students were not part of marginalized groups or identities discussed. They felt very ostracized as a trans student, especially in psychology courses dealing with sexuality and gender, as they felt that the course content was written for and by cis people. They felt very strongly that trans and queer people should be at the forefront of research on gender and sexuality, and current paradigms in those fields must be heavily scrutinized. Please take it away, Sid.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm just gonna figure out how to share my screen. Sorry, I don't really do a lot of public speaking, so I am quite nervous. Let me see. Here we go.
So if I can help at all, if you go down to the middle bar in the bottom, there should be a green share screen button.
Yep, there is.
Okay, so just try. Yeah. So just try following it through and just test it to make sure it works.
Okay. I'm sorry about this. 1 second.
It's fine. I love your description. All the work that you're working on sounds really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm applying to master's programs, so it's a stressful time. Okay, my computer will not let me share my presentation, and I'm not sure why.
It looked like it almost shared there for a second, actually.
Oh, okay.
I saw the screen blink in the way.
Okay. Allow. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
It's fine. If that doesn't work, then you can email it to me, and I'll share it from my screen.
I might have to do that.
Okay. Oh, that's weird. It almost worked that time.
Okay, I'm not sure why. It says I have to restart Zoom to be able to do it, and I don't know why.
Why don't we try that first, just because it's going to be easier if you can run it from yours, and then if it doesn't, then email it to me.
Okay, sorry about this. I guess it's a bathroom break for everyone.
It's really fine. We got plenty of time.
Okay, thank you. 1 second.
And while we're waiting, Dev has put a comment in the chat section saying that you can check out their project at cripproject.com. That's CRIPROJECT.com. So if now folks want to run off to grab a quick bite or hit the washroom, we'll probably resume, I would say, in about 3 or 4 minutes. Oh, yeah, that's working perfectly, Sid. Can you hear me? You probably have to unmute yourself. Hold on.
Yep. Sorry.
There we go. Okay. I just was telling folks to step away and have a bathroom break, like a second before you log back on. So let's give folks a couple minutes.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry again.
That's fine. There's always problems with Zoom and updates and making stuff more difficult than it has to be.
Honestly.
All right, Sid, if you want to take it away there.
Yeah, sure. So hi again. My name is Sid, and today I'm going to be talking about how gender nonconformity is pathologized in psychiatry, and the intersections of transphobia and ableism in psychiatry. My interest in this topic has really been informed by my own life. As a neurodivergent trans person, I have personally experienced, when trying to access transition care or medical care, experienced this intersection of transphobia and ableism in denying my agency. So this is kind of what made me interested in this topic and made me want to dive into the history of how gender is treated in psychiatry. And I am going to be specifically talking about classifications in the DSM. First, I wanted to talk briefly about the history of the DSM and how gender is discussed in the DSM. So the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, ostensibly provides standard diagnostic criteria for doctors in the classification of mental disorders. And I'm focusing on this manual because it is widely used by psychiatrists in North America, and official diagnoses from the DSM are used to gatekeep access to transition resources, be it medical care or legal name or gender changes, as well as other forms of support. So since its first edition, published in 1952, the DSM has invariably included some form of gender nonconforming behavior as pathology. And before I go any further, I also did want to give a brief content warning. I am discussing how psychiatry viewed trans and gender nonconforming identities in the past. It's not exactly pleasant. And there's some transphobic language, as well as some ableist ideas that are discussed. So I just wanted to give people a warning. So in this first edition of the DSM, sexual deviation was an umbrella diagnosis with instructions provided to the clinician to specify the type of deviant behavior. And some examples that were given were homosexuality, transvestitism, fetishism, and sexual sadism. Importantly, I think there's no attempt to define these in terms of symptoms or define why they are classified as mental disorders. It's really up to the clinician to understand cultural cues for these behaviors and diagnose them. And these diagnoses were classed under a broader category of sociopathic personality disorders, which, according to the manual, people in this category, quote, are ill primarily in terms of society and conformity within the prevailing cultural milieu. So the language used by the American Psychiatric Association itself acknowledges that deviation from culturally accepted behavior is sufficient justification for diagnosis of a mental disorder. There is no actual discussion of mental distress, functioning, and only the ability to conform to cultural norms. This is true for much of the language surrounding mental illness diagnoses in the DSM, not just related to gender. The intersection of ableism and transphobia that denies people agency who exists outside of these societal norms. So the DSM-2, which was published in 1968, contains very little revisions or updates to these classifications. And classifications that legitimize homophobia and transphobia, both in and outside of medical context. Prominent psychologists and psychiatrists recommended conversion therapy tactics as treatment for these disorders. So we can see how psychiatry is influenced by cultural norms, but in turn also serves to influence and reinforce these norms. So the 1970s when the DSM-2 was revised. This was an era of great cultural and social change in North America. And this resulted in the first significant change to the classification of gender nonconforming behaviors in the DSM. This occurred in 1974. Homosexuality was no longer classified as a mental disorder in the revised edition of the DSM-2 by popular vote of the APA, no less. So in the years preceding this decision, gay rights activists protested APA meetings and publicly criticized the DSM for the inclusion of homosexuality as a mental disorder. These changes seem to be a direct result of changing cultural norms as opposed to the result of any inquiry into the legitimacy or usefulness of these diagnoses. And since gender nonconforming behavior was still largely taboo in North America, trans identities were still classified as pathological at this time. And there was no investigation into discussion into other supposed sexual deviations and their relevance in the DSM. So the DSM-3, published in 1980, was the first edition of the manual that sought specifically to define gender nonconforming behaviors as a class of mental illness. These were classed as gender identity disorders, and this is when transsexualism first appears as a diagnosis. It is defined as discomfort with one's anatomical sex and a persistent desire to, quote, live as the other sex. The manual also notes, quote, the anatomic sex of most males and females with the disorder is quite apparent. I would hope this is a pretty shocking statement to appear in an official medical document. This is clearly influenced by transphobic stereotypes and not by any medical or clinical studies. This language clearly describes or reflects the views of a society that upholds strict and binary gender roles. And these social prejudices are also seen in the DSM-3 in the appearance of the diagnosis of gender identity disorder of childhood. This is defined as a persistent discomfort in a child concerning their anatomical sex, and it is diagnosed largely based on a child's inability to conform to assigned gender roles, such as wearing certain clothing or playing with certain toys. So cultural norms clearly dominate the logic for diagnoses of transsexualism and gender identity disorder of childhood in this edition of the DSM. And again, there is no actual justification for these behaviors being listed as mental disorders or dysfunctions, merely descriptions of norms being violated. So onto the DSM-4, which was published in 1994. This is when gender identity disorder replaced transsexualism as a diagnosis. However, the criteria and symptomology remained much the same. There is an increased emphasis on personal distress and impairment that gender identity disorder causes, and this is not present in previous editions. However, the implication is still that it is an individual's deviance from societal norms that causes their distress, as opposed to the material conditions that trans and gender nonconforming people often face, or the ostracization that they face as a result of existing outside of accepted cultural norms. The language used throughout the DSM is also sufficiently vague as to give individual clinicians overwhelming power over someone's access to transition. Ultimately, it is not the decision of a trans person to decide if they can access transition, but the decision of a clinician as to whether or not it's medically necessary. And I think that this reflects a deeply ableist approach to mental health care, both with regards to trans identities and mental health care generally, where the clinician is the ultimate decider of what supports someone can access based on a diagnosis, as opposed to a patient being an active participant in their own care. In the DSM-5, which is the most current edition of the DSM, published in 2013, not 2010 like it says on the slide, I'm sorry. This problem is still very much present. Gender identity disorder has been replaced by gender dysphoria, and this reclassification is the result of a culmination of a gradual push towards the emphasis on the mental distress experienced by the individual, as opposed to emphasizing an individual's behavior or ability to fit into binary gender categories. However, the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is very similar to gender identity disorder of previous editions, and it still relies heavily on a person's desire to live as the other gender, with little to no consideration of trans people that do not desire to fit within binary gender categories. Although the language is perhaps more inclusive than previous editions, there's still a clear reliance on fitting firmly within one of two gender categories. And the existence of trans people is still fundamentally seen as a medical condition. Individual trans people have some more abnormality in brain or behavior that causes this distress, as opposed to reflecting and expanding our understanding of gender outside of specific cultural norms. And I also want to note that gender nonconformity, specifically in those assigned male at birth, is pathologized in much more insidious ways in the DSM, with the diagnosis of transvestic fetishism. This is a diagnosis that is specific to transmisogyny affected people, and it essentially refers to, well, I guess if a clinician decides that a person is not presenting in a gender nonconforming way because of internal feelings of incongruity, but rather it's a sexual fetish. And again, the language is vague enough that it is ultimately up to the clinician to decide whether someone is really dysphoric or whether they have a sexual fetish that should be treated with therapy. So criticisms of this medical model of mental illness are far from new. I wanted to touch quickly on a few insightful critiques of the medical model of mental health generally, as well as specifically in the pathologization of gender nonconformity. So Erving Goffman was an early critic of psychiatry, and he argued that categorizing mental suffering as individual mental illness serves to pathologize nonconformity and human suffering. So he described the social roles that people occupy in day-to-day life as frameworks of interaction that guide acceptable behavior in any given situation. And mental illness is recognized and diagnosed by clinicians when an individual fails to remain within the confines of these frameworks. So Goffman discussed class, occupation, and familial ties as examples of such frameworks. And he wrote on this topic in the 1960s, an era where institutionalizing people with mental health problems was common, and stripping them of agency was quite easy. And those most likely to be institutionalized and forcibly medicated were those already on the margins of society, such as women, poor people, and Black and Indigenous people. This framework model can be extended to gender roles as well. Gender can be thought of as a framework through which we observe and interact with society and other individuals. So we can see how deviation from acceptable gendered frameworks was and continues to be pathologized as illness. The treatments for these illnesses still involve returning to acceptable frameworks for interaction, either through therapy for a disorder in the past or through physical transition to emulate more typical attributes of their gender. And failure to uphold these rigid gender roles by trans people is met with further stigmatization, isolation, and denial of access to resources. In the eyes of many clinicians, the goal of medical transition is often seen as getting as close to cisgender expression as possible to pass. And in much of the previous century, gender-affirming surgeries would not be performed on trans individuals who were not interested in conforming to a heterosexual lifestyle. So, for example, someone identifying as a gay trans man would be denied access to surgery on the basis that they are not really experiencing gender identity disorder because they still desire to have romantic and sexual relationships with men. Therefore, trans people's ability to express themselves was limited by these gendered frameworks of interaction. Trans people were only given access to transition if it resulted in reinforcing these rigid gender roles. In this way, trans people can still conform within socially acceptable frameworks and be seen as healthy in the eyes of mainstream psychiatry. However, this fails to reflect the true diversity of transgender people and the many ways in which trans and gender nonconforming people may desire to express ourselves in our identity. The inclusion of gender dysphoria in this most current edition of the DSM comes with the implication that the distress associated with feeling disconnected with one's internal sense of gender and how one is perceived externally is a personal pathology and not a societal one. An individual is mentally ill for experiencing distress, that their internal sense of self is not validated in the ways they are forced to interact with the world. Thus, the onus is on the individual ultimately to alleviate that distress by altering the way that they interact with these gender roles. Gender researcher Catherine Wilson has noted that DSM criteria with regards to the distinction between dysphoria and fetishism are too ill-defined and allow for the legitimization of bigotry due to the positioning of the DSM as a comprehensive and accurate manual of mental disorders. There is a lot of space for interpretation, and this can be used to deny trans feminine people access to transition resources if a clinician deems them illegitimately trans. In this way, more progressive diagnoses in the DSM still serve to reinforce transphobia and transmisogyny by having criteria for real or legitimate trans people to oppose fake trans people who should not be permitted access to transition. The concept of healthy mental functioning can really not be divorced from the cultural context in which a person exists. So as the APA moves away from pathologizing gender nonconformity and otherwise socially aberrant or uncommon behaviors as inherently disordered, I propose that it's also time to examine the ways in which psychiatric diagnoses reflect culturally specific norms of productivity and functioning as opposed to biologically determined illnesses. And through studying the history of how gender nonconformity is treated in the DSM, I think it becomes clear that neurodivergence is treated in a very similar way as gender nonconformity in psychiatry, with the assumption that neurodivergent behavior is inherently pathological, and the distress that neurodivergent people experience is due to their abnormal thoughts and behaviors, and not a reaction to how we are treated for failing to uphold socially acceptable frameworks of interaction. Accessing to support and treatment to alleviate distress is also dependent on official diagnoses. So this is a tool to gatekeep resources, deny people access to support systems. On the other hand, the presence of a specific diagnosis can be used to enforce stereotypes, deny agency to people in distress, and to deny trans people access to transition resources, as the presence of certain DSM diagnoses can make you, excuse me, I lost my train of thought. The presence of certain DSM diagnoses can cause a clinician to deny you access to transition resources. So in this way, ableism and transphobia are often deeply intertwined in medical care, not just due to the overlap between these two communities. Mental illness diagnoses, as I said, can be used to deny trans people access to hormones and surgery. And neurodivergent people are also frequently denied agency over their gender expression and sexuality. To access transition, often you must prove to a psychiatrist that you are otherwise sane, reinforcing ideas that the goal of transition is to fit into a neurotypical ciscentric culture as best as possible. So I think it's important to consider the shared experiences of mentally ill, neurodiverse, and trans people, especially since these identities often intersect. And ableism also heavily informs people's ability to access transition care. And to begin to question why gender nonconformity was and continues to be pathologized, you must also question why any number of socially uncommon or abnormal behaviors and traits are pathologized. I think that the history of gender nonconformity in psychiatry provides insight into many other human traits and behaviors that are treated as disordered because of societal inaccessibility. And I just wanted to say that this criticism is not meant to deny the legitimacy of mental suffering or to claim that this suffering can be overcome without support. However, in psychiatric settings, the support that is offered to those classified as mentally ill or neurodivergent often has the primary goal of returning the individual to an existence compatible with social norms, regardless of the desires of the individual. Another glaring example of this is the prominence of applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, to treat autism spectrum disorders. The explicit goal of this treatment is to condition behavior in children so that from the outside they act similarly to their allistic peers. Success for this treatment is measured in outward behavioral changes, not in alleviation of distress or anxiety caused by feelings of ostracization. And this treatment does not typically deal with the internal distress caused by ostracization that children with autism may experience. I think this therapy is ideologically consistent and very similar to conversion therapy. And this shared history of discrimination by medicine and specifically by psychiatry is an important bridge between trans and neurodiverse communities. Our progress cannot come at the expense of one another. And to truly dismantle psychiatric transphobia, we must fundamentally reimagine how mental illness is defined and what purpose diagnoses and treatment should serve for all neurodiverse and mentally ill people. We cannot just desire to eliminate trans identities as mental illnesses while leaving intact a system that continues to harm both cis and trans disabled people.
Hi, Sid.
Thank you.
Sorry.
That's it.
Oh.
I'm done. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
These are my slides. I know I went a little over. Sorry about that.
Everybody went a little bit over.
And these are my references. Thank you very much for your time.
That was really good and super in depth and actually really interesting for me because my research is in the same area. So,
cool.
Yeah, I won't go into it in depth, but I'm looking at how autistic trans communities develop and interact with things like healthcare.
Cool.
So one of the first things I wanted to do while we're waiting for folks to type out their questions is to kind of put the presenters in conversation with each other. So I'm curious what other presenters have, what questions other presenters might have for Sid, for example.
I thought your presentation was awesome. So,
thank you.
It just reminds me a lot. I don't know if you've read Jake Pine's work, but it reminds me of Jake Pine's work and like the connections between ABA, like applied behavioral analysis, and the regulation of gender diversity and sexual orientation, and then the regulation of autism and like the normalization element. Because ABA, as I remember it, and I think this is from Jake's article, but either way, like the history, the founder of ABA is connected to like conversion therapy for LGBTQ people, and also ABA, like applied behavioral analysis. So like obvious links between like gender diversity and like the pathologization of gender diversity, and then also the pathologization of autism. You're also reminding me a lot of, there's a scholar just finished her PhD or like a few years ago at Western called Diana Kuhl, who did a critical analysis of Kenneth Sucker and like interviews with trans folk and like a deconstruction and critique of all of his, you know, very problematic work. So you might want to check that out. Yeah, I don't know, not really a question, but just really enjoyed your presentation. So
thank you. No, I'm actually this presentation did kind of start as a spiteful project against Kenneth Sucker.
Cool.
A little bit. I mean, there was obviously other interests, but because I know until recently he did run a like gender clinic for children. Yeah, and I had a friend whose sibling had actually been referred to that clinic, and they were just talking to me about their experiences, and I was shocked to hear that a lot of the methodology that was used in this clinic was essentially conversion therapy for trans kids, like essentially, you know, trying to get their son to stop playing with a Barbie, which felt incredibly archaic. And it's kind of shocking when you look at psychiatry, because on its face, it seems, you know, they like to, I think mainstream psychiatry likes to present itself as very progressive and objective, but a lot of these holdovers from the 50s about these like very strict gender roles are still present in these diagnoses, and also in formalized treatment of trans and gender nonconforming people. Yeah, but no, I haven't read, did you say Pine? I don't think I've read
Pine. Yeah, Pine, and then Diana Krull was the other one I mentioned out of Western. And you might like Gemma Tosh's work too. Gemma Tosh is a scholar out of the UK who like talks very much about the overlaps between pathologization of neurodiversity and the pathologization of gender diversity. And Bridget Liang's work would be great too, for sure.
Awesome.
So,
thanks.
yeah.
I'm definitely going to look that up.
Cool.
Just a quick question for Sid, or a quick request. Can you stop sharing your screen so folks can see the videos? I also want to, I'm going to put a link to my own book, which is about interviews with folks who are trans and autistic. I also want to suggest, if you mentioned you're applying for grad school, if you want to get in touch, I'd be happy to kind of offer some support or advice there if you're interested in that.
Thank you so much.
So we have a question for Dev, asking, can anyone get involved with CRIP, or do you have to be a part of the collective to contribute?
So for facilitating workshops, you do have to be a part of the collective. We have brought other folks on to co-facilitate, but there is a sort of onboarding process, just because we do really focus on making sure that everyone part of the collective aligns with our goals, with our vision, and with our, like, with the expectations we have with each other, just because it's really key to sustainable collective growth, and for our, like, wellness, both physical and mental, and just organization as well. But we do collaborate with other organizations, with other folks. As individuals, we work with folks as well. So like a lot of us are very happy, like very eager to collaborate with other community members in our own fields. And so definitely feel free to like reach out to any of us and connect if there is some type of work that you want to be doing. And right now we are trying not to grow the collective too much too quickly, just because in the past we've all had experiences with collectives that have tried to take on too much too soon, and that has led to a lot of harm that has been enacted inside the community and inside the collective. And we are just like working really hard to avoid that kind of experience for ourselves and for our community. I did also have a question for Sid, if I can jump onto that. Cool. I was wondering if in your research, if there has been any work done that looks at how racialized trans people are affected specifically in that pathologization of transness.
When I was doing research for this, I honestly didn't come across anything in particular. I'm not saying, like, I can't say for sure if it's out there or not, but I definitely think there is a gap in research, especially because kind of like critical views of gender and psychiatry is already a pretty sparse field. I think that there's definitely a need. Like, I will say most of the researchers that I've come across or that I've seen cited are white, and either cis or non-trans misogyny affected. So I definitely think there's a huge need for a greater diversity of voices, because it's also, I think, a little bit disingenuous to have people that are not part of these communities continuing to talk about them or study them without any input from our communities. So yeah, sorry, that's not really an answer. I also wanted to say to you, Dev, I followed you on social media for a while, and it's really nice to meet you virtually in person. And it was really cool to hear about the collective and the work that you do. Sorry, just wanted to stand for a second.
Just a quick note about that. There are researchers who are Black and autistic and trans. I'm putting the link for a guy who's giving a presentation on YouTube in the comments. They aren't often heard as much for a number of reasons. It's more difficult to get access to diagnosis, for one, and folks tend to get characterized as having oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorders rather than autism, which means they get criminalized. Another factor is autistic people, especially nonverbal autistic people, are more likely to be at risk for police violence, but that's especially true of autistic trans people of color. And there's a number of stories about that. Sorry to interject there. I just wanted to make sure.
No. Thank you. I definitely did not. I will say I'm by no means an expert on this topic, so I definitely have like gaps in my knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of academic fields, and I think that's exactly why we're doing this work. And I also just wanted to say thank you for your comments. I've been following you as well, and I'm just so excited to actually share space with you.
Thanks.
So I want to open it up for questions broadly from folks who are here, but also obviously I want to keep having the conversation between the folks who presented. Give people a second to write in. I'm curious, Dev, you spoke to this a bit in your presentation, but what was I guess it's a little broad to put it this way, but what I want to ask is, how did you get started, or what was the motivation for starting the CRIP project? But obviously that's very broad, but I mean, how do I say this? Having the goal and the dream of doing something and then getting to doing it, there's a lot of work there and a lot of hurdle around, I think especially for neurodiverse people, around executive dysfunction maybe. And I wonder, in neurodiverse terms, and I wonder, how you kind of got over that hump and how you kept moving on it.
I was very fortunate in that when we started, Kate was already receiving requests for workshops and presentations on this kind of work because of their academic research into this work and their connections to other organizations. And so it was actually Kate who started reaching out at I believe it was the end of 2017, to see if there were racialized disabled people who would want to join them in that work, because they felt very uncomfortable acting as a community expert, as a white person, taking on that educator role. And so it really did start off with just responding to the requests that Kate was already getting. From there, it kind of like rolled forward. But in terms of starting the collective, we did dream of growing it for a few years before we actually did. It did take until we were at the point we were just like, both of us are not available to take on this opportunity, but it's such an important opportunity to share this education. We really wish we had somebody else to take on that opportunity and benefit from it as well. And especially because through this work, it has both amplified our individual work and created a lot of community connections for us. And we wanted to share that. So we, that's when I just sort of posted online being like, hey friends, are you like a racialized disabled person looking for workshop experience? And just had folks start reaching out then. And then it was sort of working together, meeting all of these folks, having conversations between myself and them, or Kate and them, and then kind of coming together and being like, okay, what is it we actually want to do? How are we going to make sure that everything aligns? And it was really just having this group of people that was holding each other accountable and could pass the torch along if there was anything that they were really struggling with. Like originally, I was going to be in charge of communications for the collective, and that left the website unupdated for 2 years. And once Kitty came along, they were like, I love doing that type of stuff. Let me take that on. And has been, a driving force in actually updating our website and our documents and things like that. So yeah, just being involved with a community of folks that are like-minded, that are already sort of building on this work and things like that has been like really helpful. And also just being aware of each other's limits and learning how to respect that, because yeah, there have been times where we don't facilitate any workshops, don't do any marketing, don't do anything like that. But we're very aware that we all have different capacities and we all have different needs that we might need to focus on, and just being respectful of that has just been really helpful in actually being able to communicate with each other and actually work with each other on getting through some of these executive dysfunctions and being able to support each other.
That's really great. Thank you. I have a question that just came in for Adam from Mackenzie Stewart, asking, how does the work that you do surrounding inclusion in education come into your role as a professor, and what do you do to ensure equity in the classroom?
That's a great question. So I feel like, especially with everything being online and Zoom, it's a particularly pertinent question. And one thing for me is firstly, I try to ensure that everything has the live transcription enabled right from the get-go. So I try to ensure that no students have to go out of their way to ask for that. It's just ready to go from the beginning of the class, just because I've been teaching on Zoom this semester. And then the same thing with the renaming function, so that students can feel free, if they would like to do so, to add their pronouns from the beginning without having to ask to do so. I also try to ensure that everything is also readily available, both through Zoom and also in terms of content posted on my CourseLink website. And I realize that many students, for various reasons, especially due to mental health, with everything going on in the world right now, may or may not be able to make it to class. So I try to make it so that any student can be just as successful if they're unable to make it to class for whatever reason. But then also at the same time, I try to make it so that students can participate in class without having to speak out loud. I realize that a lot of my students in particular might have various mental health conditions or anxieties around talking out loud in a large class format. And so that's where I find Zoom really, really helpful. And so I allow students space to participate on Zoom. And I also use an app called Top Hat. And the only part of Top Hat that I use is the function that allows for discussion. So students can type out their answers, and then the answers to the questions show up on the screen. And then they can feel that they're participating without actually having to verbally say anything out loud in class. I also do some breakout room stuff, but also allow students the opportunity to work independently if they don't want to go in the breakout room, because I realize that for many students, breakout rooms can be anxiety inducing, even though a lot of times I think people use them because they think that it reduces anxiety, but that isn't always the case. So I allow students the ability to actually go in the breakout room or not go out in the breakout room. And then, I mean, in general, my courses tend to be more social justice oriented. So I teach a lot of classes around disability and inclusion, but I really try to encourage the students to think beyond the medical models. So a good portion of my courses actually like predominantly critiquing the DSM and the medical model frameworks. And I really try to emphasize, in particular, disabled activists. So I show a lot of TikTok videos and a lot of different media from disabled activists, and introduce students to activists that they might not encounter on their own. And I try to centralize their voices, especially when it's on topics related to disability that I can't personally speak to in my own lived experience. So yeah, I guess I hope that gives a little bit of a glimpse, but yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you. And I have found, as just TAing, that it's there are some good things about everything being by distance,
Yes.
especially in terms of accessibility.
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like a lot of the times we think of Zoom as a hindrance to accessibility. And what I've found is that for a lot of students who might not be able to go to campus for various reasons, again, whether it's mental health related or whatnot, it actually makes it more accessible for them to be able to go to class if it's just online versus if it's going all the way to campus. And as someone who has chronic mental illness myself, I feel like it's a little bit easier to go on Zoom sometimes than like to muster the strength to go to campus. So I also like the accessibility element that Zoom is just easier for people to reach. But then at the same time, obviously, there's other elements of Zoom that aren't as accessible, but there are ways to kind of work around that. And like I said, I like the fact that I can preemptively have like the transcript ready to go without a student having to ask for it, and get the naming function or the renaming function ready to go right from the get-go. And that way no one has to go out of their way and feel kind of maybe othered in some sense by having to ask for it on their own. So yeah, pros and cons to Zoom for sure.
Well, and I think one of the interesting things, if you want to say it that way, about COVID's impact on this kind of thing is a lot of the things that a lot of the accessibility asks that people with disabilities were asking for, or trans folks were asking for, and we're always told, oh well, that we need to do a feasibility study. That's not possible. We can't do medical appointments by phone. We need to see you. Suddenly became instantly possible
Exactly.
overnight when it wasn't
Yeah.
about being disabled or trans.
Totally, 100%. So, I mean, again, goes to show the fact that like we treat disabled people in our society, I feel like as dispendable almost. And then at the same time, like as soon as, like you said, the accessibility options are required for everyone, suddenly those things are easier to put in place. So.
Well, I kind of always go by I think a lot of people will tell you in life that things aren't possible because they can't imagine it being possible, or it wasn't possible for them. But, maybe sometimes it's better to just do it and beg for forgiveness than ask for permission.
Exactly. Totally. 100%.
So I want to open it up again for more broad comments. We've had a couple of really good questions via the Q&A function. I'm mindful that it can be a little bit difficult to navigate Zoom. So if you're finding it difficult to ask your questions via Q&A, feel free to put them in the chat box as well. And I wonder if, sort of a broader question, but I wonder, this is my first year participating in the sex salon myself, and I'm curious to hear from folks who were presenters about what motivated you to submit your research or submit your work for the salon.
I mean, I can say I did my PhD at University of Toronto, so I'm very I did it at OISE actually, and I also did it in the STS department. So I presented at the Sex Salon series before, and I know Ryan, and so yeah, I'm very well acquainted with STS as a department. So.
I mean, personally, I'm not really much of a public speaker. I can't say I'm much of an academic either, but this, at least the kind of archival research that I did with the DSM was something that stuck with me for a while, and it's something that I've wanted to develop for a long time, and I thought that this would be an interesting avenue to talk about it. And I also really wanted to be able to discuss this with people that were doing similar work or had similar experiences with disability and gender.
I just want to say quickly, I appreciate the modesty, Sid, but I think that you are quite an academic and that you did a really good job of the presentation.
Thank you.
For myself, I've actually worked with Ryan before. We were on a roundtable back in 2020 around gender and Indo-Caribbean identity. And also recently I had Ryan on my podcast. Quick shameless plug. It's called Jumbie. It's a horror storytelling podcast from about ghost and monster stories from colonized cultures. But and so Ryan had actually reached out to me asking if I would like to present anything. But that's mostly because the call had come around during a particularly busy time for myself. And so I just missed the deadline. I had originally been interested in submitting, talking about CRIP, just because I do think we're doing some really great work, and I would really love to see us be able to connect with other folks doing this kind of work or interested in learning from us, or helping us grow in some capacity, or collaborating. So just very excited to be able to share the work that we're doing, especially now that we have invited on such amazing new members of the collective. It's just been so thrilling to have them involved, and I really do want to share the things that they've contributed to the collective.
Awesome. Dev, I'm looking it up, but you'll probably be faster to get to it. But do you want to put the link for your podcast in the chat? I'd love to check that out.
Sure. Let's.
And just while you're doing that, Christopher, you had put your hand up in the attendees. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Oh no, it wasn't a question, and I might have unheard or misheard the question that you're posing, because I have presented at the Sex Salon twice, and so I was just going to add that part of the reason why I decided to do so is because it's a very convivial environment to share research with individuals that you may not necessarily know personally, but have heard about their work. And so it's always been a very wonderfully supportive and intellectually stimulating experience. Don't hate me, but I had the benefit of doing my first experience with the Sex Salon when we were in person, and it was a blast. Very nice and cozy, very salonish, if you imagine like how philosophers would sit in a salon. But I just wanted to throw that out there for anyone who might be interested, who's in the audience that are thinking about sharing their work in the future. It's a great environment.
Awesome. Thank you for speaking up about that. And Dev has put the link to their podcast in the chat, which I really think people should check out.